Congratulations. Now, in 2021, the Department of Social Protection commissioned an Indecon report on the cost of disability in Ireland. The report found that the average costs were somewhere between €8,700 and €12,300. The cost of living has increased since then and then some. The equivalent figures for today between 10 and 14,000. The cost of heating when you're confined to your house for most of the day. The cost of taxis when you need them to venture out, before you even get to the cost of making modifications to your own home. The cost of disability is a major contributory factor in the 1 in 2 disabled people living in deprivation, 1 in 5 living in consistent poverty, and the rate of homelessness being twice what it is for the rest of the population. What needs to be done now to tackle this? Number 1, provide all persons with disability with a universal payment. Number 2, scrap the means test for receiving that payment. Number 3, set it at a level which fully covers the cost of disability. And number 4, allow disabled people to work and to earn money without it affecting that payment. Disability activists are gathering at the gates of the Dáil at 11 a.m. to promote these demands, and I hope that the media listening into the debate will cover their action. The motion includes the following words: the state has failed children with disabilities and their parents and guardians. 8,893 children are now overdue for assessment of need, with 6,963 waiting more than 3 months. 17,157 waiting for first contact with the Children's Disability Network team, with a waiting list for treatment of over 110,000. How much human misery, Minister, is stored up within those statistics? And of course, that's without mentioning the large number of parents with children with autism who still don't know whether their child will have a place to go to school this September. Now, on May the 7th, the High Court will hear a case taken by 2 Cork parents on behalf of their daughter, who is diagnosed with intellectual disability, autism and epilepsy. Her assessment of needs outlines the need for physiotherapy, occupational therapy, speech and language therapy, psychology, but not one of these services has ever been provided by the state. The parents are making the case that the state should be compelled to provide those services. The state is planning to fight the case and to spend nearly €30,000 in doing so. Senator Tom Clonan's Disability Miscellaneous Provisions Bill 2023 also aims to compel the state to provide services identified by an assessment of need. Will the Minister tell the House as to whether the Government will support or oppose that proposed legislation? I'd like to close my opening remarks by reading into the record of the House the words of a number of young disability activists. Anya O'Hara of Chronic Collective said yesterday, "We're forced to fundraise for medical treatment, forced to leave the country for surgery, forced to depend on family and friends for vital care due to severely lacking access to personal assistant hours. We are forced into poverty. Ireland is not an equitable country for disabled people, and we need to change this. We need a social change, a switch from viewing us as a burden, an issue, a problem, into seeing us as a vibrant, knowledgeable and valuable community members that we are." Kayleigh McKevitt of Access for All said, "We still have a long way to go, and I hope we get there before the next generation of young disabled people have to fight." And the mental health activist Blessing Dada identified individualism, ableism, capitalism and fascism as obstacles on the road to disability justice, stating, "Ableism convinced you that your health is untouchable if you do X, Y and Z. Capitalism convinced you to return to normal so the rich can continue to profit from bad health." I think it is interesting that all of these young disabled activists, fresh from defeating this government on 2 fronts, identify the need for radical social change from below. I fully concur with this sentiment. The ableist, capitalist system, which puts profit before people and devalues disabled people because they feel they are less likely to squeeze profit from them is at the root of the problems here. We need a society which will, in the words of Karl Marx, allow each to contribute to society according to their ability and to take from society according to their needs. In other words, a truly human, genuinely democratic and socialist society.
Thanks, Chair. Minister, disability justice is social justice, and social justice is disability justice. And the Green Paper that was scrapped earlier this week was straight out of the handbook of the authorities. And if you looked at what the disability payments scandal done to people in Britain, it just shows you that pushing people to the margins already compounds a particularly terrible issue. And disabled people are proportionally suffer from poverty, alienation, deprivation in terms of employment, in terms of living. And people will disabled people will suffer disproportionately, in particularly employment, discrimination. And me and you may not kind of, suffer that, but somebody being disabled will suffer that. And it's obviously, it's very insidious how this discrimination happens. And this is a wide kind of, a broad spectrum, Minister, in relation to justice for people with disabilities. And I touch on one particular issue around children. We have this pretty farcical situation around assessment of needs. Now, assessment of needs as a concept is a good concept, but the concept is when you get that assessment of needs, you get the services for your child. Now, that's not happening. And then you have even more of a bizarre circumstances where the Disability Act 2005 is constantly breached by your government in terms of children trying to get these services. And when a parent comes into our office in terms of this issue, my heart absolutely sinks, because I know the road that they're going to go down, because the road is almost a dead end in terms of services for their child. Because if you get the early intervention for children in terms of speech and language, any of them services which are vital, if a child does not get them at that particular time, the consequences are pretty bad. And why a child cannot get them kind of services is horrendous. There's a number of other issues, Minister, in terms of the optional protocol, the UNCRPD. Why that hasn't been implemented doesn't really make sense. I'd like to kind of hear your views in relation to that. Also about personal assistance, and I have kind of first-hand knowledge of personal assistance. I was a personal assistant for a long time, and particularly people that want to independently live in their own home. You can't put a price on that service. You just can't. It's really, really important that personal assistance in terms of pay and conditions are kind of increased, because this is a very, very vital job in terms of assisted living and trying to give people a kind of an independence, while at the same time, there's a communication and a social kind of a value, a huge social value to personal assistance. And I think it's very undervalued in our society in relation to this, particularly around disabilities. So I think, Minister, this is a very, very important issue around personal assistance, and hopefully with this kind of motion and other motions going forward, that social justice can be done for those that are living with disabilities in Ireland. Thank you.
Deputy Paul Murphy.
Thanks.
Minutes.
First of all, I want to start by thanking all the disabled people's organisations who have participated in preparing this motion. Their demands are front and centre, which is exactly as it should be. So far, there's no sign of a government counter-motion, so I presume from that means that the government is not going to oppose our motion, will allow it to pass. Before there's uproar and celebration in the gallery, I would just warn that this government has a long and not very proud history of allowing motions to pass and then not doing anything about the things that are passed in the motion. So I would say that if this passes this evening, that is obviously welcome, but it needs to be implemented. There are 6 main demands in this motion. The government has so far fully committed to one, to immediately scrap the Green Paper. That is, of course, welcome. What was proposed was a Tory-style workfare regime reminiscent of the film I, Daniel Blake. I remember when I first raised that with the former Taoiseach Leo Varadkar, he said that I, Daniel Blake was a good movie, but one-sided, and you should watch Benefit Street to see the other side of the story, encapsulating this Tory mindset of deserving, undeserving people with disabilities. The fact that you all came up with such draconian proposals in the first place reveals an awful lot about the attitude to people with disabilities. I unfortunately think that that Tory mindset is not gone as a consequence of the decision to scrap the Green Paper. For too long, disabled people have been treated appallingly by the Irish state, committed to institutions, forced to live in poverty and isolation, prevented from participating equally in society and denied fundamental human rights. That has to stop. Disabled people are uniting, are organising to demand their rights. And it is high time that the government and the state started really listening to them, started consulting with them in a meaningful way rather than proposing policies from on high that fail to meet their needs. One would hope that the scrapping of the Green Paper is a step in that direction. Let us see. There will certainly be a push to demand it. That would not have happened without the determined campaign of resistance ever since the Green Paper was first published. The government attempted to ignore that, attempted to push on, but disabled activists did not back down, and in the end, they have won this important victory. That and the massive no vote in the care referendum should put the government and the institutions of the state on notice that ignoring and mistreating people with disabilities and carers will not be possible any longer. The government must start taking meaningful steps towards guaranteeing equal rights for disabled people. Tokenism will not be tolerated. The government is absolutely awash with cash, has more than enough money that should be put where its mouth is. There must be no more striving to support. We need real action and real resources now. We have heard from disabled people's organisations about what kind of system and resources they need. They want universal payments that cover the real costs of having a disability and provide them with reliable income security. No one should have to live in poverty, and certainly not because they have a disability. But poverty and deprivation are what many thousands of people in this country endure on a daily basis. 1 in 5 people who are unable to work due to long-standing health problems live in consistent poverty, and 1 in 2 live in deprivation. That is shameful. Disabled people are twice as likely to be homeless, far less likely to have a job, with the highest rate of unemployment in the EU. It's important to point out that the Irish state is not just kind of failing to meet the needs of people who are disabled. The Irish state is disabling people by failing to put in place the mechanisms to support people. A key mechanism through which this is done is the dehumanising and traumatising system of means tests. It is degrading, it is time-consuming, it wastes resources that should actually be used to help people instead of forcing them to continually prove and reprove that they need assistance. It has no purpose other than a form of state discipline, a way of discouraging people from getting what they are entitled to, humiliating them for having needs, and minimising what the state so reluctantly doles out. It situates everyone in need of assistance as a potential welfare cheat, not to be trusted. That's what Leo Varadkar was getting at with his Benefit Street reference. It should have no place anywhere in our social welfare system, and it must be abolished. We in People Before Profit stand for universal benefits and universal public services for all. For carers, this must provide a real living wage that recognises the essential work that they do day in, day out. Globally, capitalism saves $11 trillion a year from unpaid care work, and many trillions more by systematically underpaying paid care workers, most of whom are women. We need a massive expansion of personal assistance hours to enable people to participate fully in society, and we also need to ensure that personal assistants and all other care workers get the pay and conditions that they deserve. We cannot continue with a society that gives golden handshakes to bankers and executives, but the cold shoulder to disabled people and carers. It's welcome that Simon Harris has finally committed to ratifying the optional protocol to the UN CRPD this year. However, we still have no date as to when this will happen. Time is ticking on this government, and we need it to ratify the protocol now. The new Taoiseach has also said that the backlog in assessments of needs has to be unblocked, but we haven't seen any details as to how this will happen. Almost 9,000 children are overdue for assessment of needs. Over 17,000 are waiting for first contact with the CDNT, a Children's Disability Network team. I have figures which an activist got from extensive FOIs, which indicate that almost 9,000 children have been waiting almost 12 months for those initial contacts. And those FOI reveal, one, mistakes right across the board in terms of the figures, discrepancies in the figures, which means there's a real problem in terms of planning if there's all these discrepancies. But it also reveals the cause of these problems, of the massive delay. The vacancy rates across the board in terms of therapists and so on is through the roof. 40% for occupational therapists, 70% for dietitians, 30% for family support workers, 30% for care assistants, 70% for play therapists. I could go on and list these. And so the result is that even when children get an assessment of needs, over 110,000 are on a waiting list for treatment. The Ombudsman for Children has accused the state of a profound violation of children's rights in relation to disability care. The report, Nowhere to Turn, aptly describes how children with complex disabilities are left in inappropriate settings for months due to the failure of the state to provide them with home supports. Parents are forced to fight for services for their children, which are considered basic human rights in most European countries. The truth is that this state has never cherished all of the children of the nation equally, and this government is continuing that disgraceful tradition of discrimination and neglect. Rather than speculating €100 billion in public money on international markets, as they're planning to do with the Future Ireland Fund, they should be invested in public services and a better quality of life for all who live here right now. From assessment of needs to financial and respite support to parents and carers, raising pay and conditions for workers in the disability sector, all of the arms of the state need to work together and take responsibility instead of passing the buck between them and outsourcing services to underfunded NGOs reliant on charitable fundraising. Final point is our final demand in the motion for a constitutional amendment to assert equality for disabled people and guarantee rights for all.
Your time is up.
That's what we need.
Thank you, Government. Minister Heather Humphrey, please. 10 minutes.
I welcome the opportunity this morning to discuss the important issue of supports for disabled people. I launched the consultation process on the Green Paper last September, and I think it is very important to say that's all the Green Paper ever was. A consultation document. I want to be very clear about that. Based on the feedback we have received to date, it is clear to me that there are significant concerns about the proposals. So I have listened to these concerns, and I announced last week that we will not be proceeding with the Green Paper proposals. Our new Taoiseach, Simon Harris, has placed a major focus on improving supports for people with disabilities by giving a voice to special education at the Cabinet table in Minister Hildegard Naughton, and also with the establishment of a new special Cabinet Committee on Disability. As a government, we need to have a fresh look at how we can best support people with disabilities, and I believe that this will be best done on a whole-of-government basis through the new Cabinet Committee. There are still concerns about the cost of disability, poverty risks and low employment participation by disabled people, which further adds to marginalisation. The Government remains committed to tackling these issues through the new Cabinet Committee. I welcome the broader, holistic focus that the new Cabinet Committee will bring to these issues across government, particularly in relation to the provision of services. My department will use the feedback and submissions we have received through the Green Paper public consultation, and there was extensive public consultation, to inform the broader review of disability supports and services under this new Cabinet Committee. The Government is also in the process of adopting a new National Disability Strategy, which should further improve service delivery across all departments and agencies. During my time as Minister for Social Protection, I have been very committed to supporting disabled people. I have increased weekly disability payments by €29 per week over the last 3 years. In Budget 2024, I made a number of lump sum payments for disabled people, including a €400 payment in November, a Christmas bonus double payment in December and a cost of living double payment in January. And I've been very keen to improve employment opportunities for disabled people. And I know how important the wage subsidy scheme is in this regard. My department is conducting a review of this scheme at the moment, but in the meantime I secured an additional €3.7 million to reduce the minimum required hours from 21 hours to 15 hours per week. This change came in at the beginning of April, and I expect it to result in an increase in the number of people availing of this scheme over the coming months. I'm also expanding the Reasonable Accommodation Fund and Disability Awareness Support Scheme based on a review published by my department in August of last year. The new scheme will combine the two grants, simplify the application process and extend the eligibility and funding for the 7 supports that will be available. I look forward to launching the new reform scheme in the coming weeks. I have been pleased in recent months to work with Epilepsy Ireland to extend my department's free travel scheme to any person who is medically certified as not fit to drive for 12 months or longer from July onwards. Over 32,000 people are expected to benefit from this measure this year. For those who think sometimes governments don't listen, well, we do. That change is a major change to the free travel scheme, and it is a direct result of engagement and collaboration with Epilepsy Ireland. These changes build on previous measures I have introduced to expand my department's income and employment supports. Under Budget 2023, I increased the earnings disregard for disability allowance and blind pension from €140 to €165 per week. People can now earn up to €165 per week and keep their payment in full, or earn up to €505.10 per week and keep a small portion of their payment and all their secondary benefits. This government remains committed to complying with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Ireland fully ratified this convention in 2018 and is committed to ratifying the optional protocol at the earliest possible date. In this regard, Minister O'Gorman's officials will this month convene an interdepartmental group to work through issues and enable ratification of the optional protocol. This interdepartmental group will include representations from all relevant government departments, including my own. Minister O'Gorman will subsequently report to Cabinet on the work of this group. Regarding assessment of need, the Government and the HSE are strongly committed to the improvement of children's disability services through the Roadmap for Service Improvement 2023 to 2026. Funding was provided in both Budget 2023 and 2024 of €16.5 million to address waiting lists for clinical assessments. And I do know that Minister Anne Rabbitte engages on a daily basis with people people who have disabilities and also their families. And in fact, only last week she was in County Monaghan and I, along with her, met a number of groups in my own county and County Cavan to discuss, and she did provide additional supports for people with disabilities, particularly in the area of respite. And I know that we need to take a serious and fresh look at how we can better support people with disabilities. Any change in income and employment supports must be looked at in the context of disabled people's access to transport, healthcare, education, career guidance, and it needs to be framed in the context of a human rights-based approach and the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Going forward, my department will work closely with other departments across government to do this, both through the new National Disability Strategy and through the newly established Cabinet Committee on Disability. And I believe this whole-of-government approach will allow us to best identify the issues people with disabilities face and the most appropriate ways to address them. We will also consult and collaborate with disabled persons organisations, disability support organisations and disabled people. And we must ensure that whatever we do, we address the poverty risks and improve employment outcomes for people with disabilities and mitigate the cost of disability. So I am confident that we can all work together on that shared objective.
People for Profit, Deputy Richard Boyd Barrett, 10 minutes.
The failure of the government to vindicate the rights of people with disabilities, successive governments, is testified to by many, many failures, but one that sort of really sums it up is that for 11 years there was a campaign by people with disabilities, disability activists, just to get the government to honour their commitment to ratify the UNCRPD. It took 11 years of campaigning from when the first commitment to ratify the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities to that actual ratification happening in 2018. And it was only because of relentless, ongoing protests by the disability community that finally happened. And then, and it's sort of laughable, the Minister says, we will ratify the optional protocol at the first available opportunity. The first available opportunity was when you ratified the UNCRPD, and you didn't ratify the optional protocol, and that was a conscious decision. Because, of course, the optional protocol would have made government accountable for actually making the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities a reality, and have given accountability and recourse to people with disabilities if a government failed to vindicate their rights. And that's why you have not ratified the optional protocol, and you have done so deliberately. You've deliberately refused to do it. And the Green Paper further underlines that point. An absolute insult, a Tory-style league table of disabilities driven by essentially an organised suspicion that people with disabilities are somehow conning the state and looking for ways to cut them off their payments and force them into inappropriate employment. That is the reality of the Green Paper, and that is how it was perceived by the disability community, because you did not consult with their organisations. Not according to them. And the reason, I didn't interrupt you. And the reason the government got a kicking in the recent referendum was precisely for that reason. That people with disabilities felt insulted, they felt treated with contempt, they felt ignored, they expected to be given rights in that referendum. And my God, I certainly am not a fan, and I don't think anybody could be, of the previous constitutional wording, which, by the way, did nothing for people with disabilities either. But the reason they voted no was because they expected to be given rights, and they were not given rights. And again, it was a conscious decision by the government. Don't put too strong a wording in case people with disabilities actually have enforceable legal rights. So these are conscious decisions. Now, what are the consequences of that attitude of government for people with disabilities? Well, as our motion says, first of all, they have additional costs on top of the rest of the population of between 9,000 and 13,000 euro a year, for which there is little support, certainly wholly inadequate support to take into account the costs of disability. As a result, 1 in 5 of those who are unable to work due to long-standing health problems live in consistent poverty. 1 in 2 live in deprivation. People with disabilities twice as likely to be homeless, more likely to be unemployed or underemployed, with Ireland having the highest level of unemployment among disabled people in the European Union. Twice as likely to leave school early, more likely to suffer with ill health, with 25% reporting bad or very bad health, 43% suffering depression, and a quarter have unmet health needs. That's the reality as a result of the failure of the government to listen and respond to the needs of people with disabilities and to enforce their rights to equality, which they have under the UN CRPD. On the area of special needs, as has already been referred to, the issue of assessment, absolute disgrace. Thousands of people, more than 8,000 people waiting for assessments of needs. Regularly now in my office, we have to refer families with children with special needs looking for assessments to barristers to go to court in order to get their assessments of needs. That's the way, that is the route now to get your assessment, and then when you get your assessment, the chances of you actually getting the services you need are virtually zero because of the chronic understaffing and under-resourcing of child and disability network teams, CAMS teams, and so on. And a game, indeed, of pushing people from one to the other. Oh, this is, no, you're supposed to go to CAMS, not to the CDNT, or vice versa, but all of them are understaffed, under-resourced, in any event. But I'll just give you some examples of the public meeting we held in Dunleary recently. A 9-year-old, her parents, was identified with issues at the age of 6, had an initial assessment with CAMS with a query of ASD. She is now 9, so she first identified issues at 6. She still has not had an assessment of need, and they were told they did not meet the criteria for the Child and Disability Network team. She has had no interventions at all. The school consider her a flight risk. She's refusing to go to school on many days, and her parents have to skip work because of this. Another child aged 11 with severe ASD allocated homeschooling. His mother was coping with that for a number of years, but last September this became impossible. And it was February before she got a placement. She currently faces no placement for the autumn again, as her young boy is due to go to secondary school. Another mother who was in at the meeting, 17-year-old, her child is 17, was diagnosed with ASD at age 6. And since then, right, so there's 11 years, 3 interventions. That's it. 3 OT interventions in that time. And when he hits 18, he will lose all his supports entirely. On the disability issue, in terms of housing, I'm currently fighting a case with a lovely young woman who has had 2 twins she loves, beautiful twins, but sadly those twins have been diagnosed with probably a unique diagnosis anywhere in the history of the world. Both children have cystic fibrosis and muscular dystrophy. To the doctor's knowledge, there has never been a diagnosis like that. We are fighting for I don't know how long now with the council to get housing priority to meet those children's needs. And even as we speak, the council are resisting and trying to push them into accepting housing that their doctors, the consultants and so on says do not meet those children's needs. Now just imagine how hard it is for a young woman with 2 children with that diagnosis, which is going to be completely life-changing for her, where we are talking about conditions that are going to worsen over time. Both her children will end up in wheelchairs, where there's infection, constant infection issues, and so on. She needs very particular types of housing, but the council are resisting her in terms of giving her the housing that she needs and trying to force her into something that will not meet her needs. And indeed, there's even a fear at the moment she may be knocked off the housing list if she doesn't accept what they're trying to force down her throat. Right? It's absolutely outrageous. Another woman we're dealing with at the moment, whose child, she's in a homeless hub with a 3-year-old and a 5-week-old, and the 5-week-old has just been diagnosed with cystic fibrosis, and she's in this homeless hub, obviously the worst place for a child with cystic fibrosis, where there is a constant fear of infection because of the number of people, and she is trapped in a homeless hub. I could go on. What do we need? We need the government to accept the rights of people with disabilities. We need to end the disgraceful means testing of disability payments, carers payments, and so on. We need to have a new referendum to establish the constitutional rights of people with disabilities, and we need universal payments that actually take into account the cost of living, and we need housing to be provided and transport to be provided that actually makes equality and accessibility a reality for people with disabilities.
The next slot is Sinn Féin slot. There's a number of speakers, and I'm just asking everybody to be fair to their members and take their time slot. And the first one is Deputy Jennifer O'Leary. 5 minutes.
Minister, the announcement last week that the Green Paper on disability payments was being scrapped was received with relief, I think, by an awful lot of people with disabilities, but it does, of course, raise further questions as to what happens next. Since the consultation was announced, and I think in several respects parts of it were badly handled, I know myself and my colleague, our disability spokesperson, Pauline Tully, met well over a dozen groups representing disabled persons. There were issues in relation to the consultation and technology and so on. A big concern and a big frustration was that this, while it was a consultation, that the initial proposal wasn't arrived at by co-design, and the feeling that people with disabilities and their priorities weren't built into the process right from the very outset, that the department brought forward a proposal and then sought to consult upon that basis, and this was one of the big concerns that was raised by us with us now. And I see some engagement between the Minister and officials. Perhaps there are things I'm not aware of, but certainly this is the issues that were brought to us, and these were the concerns that were raised with us. The proposal, such as it was, had a number of substantial flaws, and I think the biggest one in terms of the philosophy underpinning it is that it conflated the cost of disability with severity of disability. And obviously the cost of disability, as we know from the Indicon report and lots of other sources, that's variable on a whole lot of things, not just the severity of their disability. It can vary an awful lot depending on whether you live alone, whether you are living in rural Ireland, or whether you're living in an urban setting, and all these kind of things. And the demand that has been out there has been for a cost of disability payment, and we, in our alternative budget, proposed an additional uplift for people beyond the general increase that we had for working age payments. We proposed an increase of up to €20 of a payment increase for people on disability related payments. But more than that is needed as well. There is a need for us now to examine a particular cost of disability payment. I also think that it treated, the fact is that people with disabilities in Ireland are far more likely to be at risk of poverty and far less likely to be in employment than not only the general population but also their peers across Europe. We have one of the lowest rates of employment. But this seemed to focus very much on using social welfare as labour activation, rather than actually looking at some of the significant obstacles that exist to disabled people being able to access the workplace. For example, I've raised in the past the whole issue of the fact that the wage subsidy scheme hasn't kept pace with the increases in the minimum wage. So the differential advantage that there is for employers to employ people with disabilities has been reduced. But there's also the issues, the cultural issues that need to be tackled in terms of the attitudes of employers and the fact that they don't always appreciate what the ways in which people with disabilities can contribute to the workplace in which they're responsible for. And also issues in terms of intro. I think there's an awful lot of work that needs to be done in terms of intro, but this Green Paper seemed to develop a strategy that really, you were talking about 3 tiers, and in the 3rd tier, you know, the department told us that there was no sanctions. Basically, the strategy seemed to be, we're going to get intro people to sit on these people until they find something, even if that work or that training is unsuitable. That is what people effectively heard. I know the Minister kept on saying that there was no sanction, but the architecture was being created. And I believe, I do accept the sincerity of the Minister in this. I don't believe that the Minister was setting out to create a system that would force people with disabilities to go into unsuitable employment. I accept the bona fides of the Minister in that regard. But the architecture was being created that a subsequent Minister could quite easily go into that direction. And it does seem to me, if you have a system of 3 tiers and one that's not being reviewed, and the 3rd, which is people that are, you know, the implied sense of it is that they're capable of working, and many of them are capable of working, but they should be helped to work when they in the way that they want to work, rather than being forced into unsuitable employment. If there is a system like that, the implied element of it is that there is a sanction and that eventually people will be forced. I know that might not have been the intention, but that is how it's heard. The question is what happens next, because there are still issues with the system of disability payments. There are inconsistencies. You don't get stamp on disability, you do on invalidity, issues like that. But the cost of disability payment needs to be to the fore of what happens next.
5 minutes.
And look, I want to welcome the decision to scrap the Green Paper on disability reform also. My colleagues in Sinn Féin and I had grave reservations about this Green Paper, and we had called for it to be binned. And as Sinn Féin spokesperson on disability, along with our spokesperson on social protection, Deputy Donald O'Leary, we met a wide range of disabled people and disabled persons organisations and disability organisations to discuss the Green Paper. And we did this because it was extremely important to hear the views of members of the disability community directly. And I know, Minister, you say there was consultation, but I'm not sure that there was consultation with DPOs prior to the Green Paper being designed. Like, DPOs should have been consulted early in the process and been involved in the co-design of any proposals, because it would have meant that, you know, much of the fear and concern would have been allayed. It actually would have been a different paper, completely different proposals, had disabled people been involved. And the consultation that took place after the Green Paper, again, there's been a lot of complaints about it, and a lot of people felt it wasn't very well organised and demonstrated a total lack of respect for people with disabilities. And the concerns that were expressed to us around the proposals were that many of the proposals in the Green Paper were based on the outdated medical model rather than the social or rights-based model which underpins the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So this further highlights the necessity of ratifying the optional protocol on the UN CRPD. And until this happens, I think what we're going to continue to hear the government talk about implementing a rights-based framework on disability, but while in fact, as we saw with these proposals, deliver further proposals and legislation which is underpinned with a medical model perspective. And I know you've talked there in your speech about a new special Cabinet Committee on Disability, and I'm hoping that they will meet with the DPOs and discuss what issues need to be addressed, because if they don't, they're in contravention of the UNCRPD and it will not go anywhere. And we all just want to see things progressed in this area. I mean, we have the lowest level of employment among disabled people in the EU. We also have a very high cost of disability. So we do need to see urgent system change to ensure people don't fall further into the below the poverty line. So a major issue with the proposals contained in the Green Paper is that they wrongfully conflated the cost of disability with employment and capacity to work. So it viewed employment as a way of somehow reducing the cost of disability, when it can actually be the case that employment can often increase these costs. For example, you will have transport costs. You may have to find accommodation close to your place of work. You may have to purchase adaptive or assistive technology. You may have to employ personal assistants. So all of those are additional costs. And I nowhere in the proposals was there any attempt to deal with the barriers that currently exist that prevent disabled people from taking up employment, because the vast majority of disabled people want to work, and it's much more important than simply about earning money. It opens up social opportunities, it yields a feeling of self-worth, but the Green Paper doesn't consider the structural barriers disabled people face in accessing employment in terms of both educational opportunities, the lack of accessible transport, the inaccessibility of the built environment, the lack of jobs that are accessible, the failure to provide adequate support and so on. One of our local election candidates is a wheelchair user based in County Longford, and she informed me she has never been in paid employment, and she is a very capable young woman of roughly 30 years of age. She has always been in voluntary employment. She's okay to do unpaid work, but not to do paid employment. We have to change that system. That's not fair. So creating a link between the cost of disability and employment suggests people with disabilities are not trying hard enough to find employment, and that's leading to fears that these proposals were similar to the British welfare reforms, so negatively affecting disabled people. So while the overall direction of the Green Paper was regressive, some of the proposals should be progressed. For example, we welcome the proposal for higher rates of disability payments, and a single disability payment system properly designed could also make sense as long as it's based on a social or rights model. I suppose for us the priority is to ensure people with disabilities are protected from poverty, and that we do not make the mistake of other jurisdictions of having punitive work assessments like those used in Britain. And many other deputies have raised the issue of the lack of support for children with additional needs and for autistic children. And I just want to say that I agree completely with that. The situation within our own constituency, Minister of Cavan Monaghan, is dismal. Neither CDNT is functioning. There are huge staff shortages. There are huge waiting lists for assessment, huge waiting lists for services, and that again has to be addressed if we're going to ensure that our children progress in life and can live a fully integrated life.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Ford.
Minister, I want to use my limited time to speak about how children with disabilities are being failed by your government, and I acknowledge this is more Minister Rabbitt's brief than your own, but I'm going to give you an example of one young boy from my constituency who I call John for the purpose of anonymity. John is 11 years old. John started the assessments of needs process in 2020. His mother reports that John is showing signs of ASD and is waiting for a psychology assessment as part of this assessment of needs. His condition is deteriorating since 2020. The past 2 years, John has missed 40 days of school due to anxiety. This was previously averaged around 10. His mother submitted a complaint under the Disability Act to the HSA in May of last year. This complaint was upheld and recommended that John receive an assessment of needs no later than the 5th of April 2024. April the 5th has come and went, and John has still not received this assessment of needs. Minister, John's situation is not unique. There are thousands of Johns right across the state. It breaks my heart every time I have to send a copy and paste answer from the HSE back to parents desperate to get the help that their children need. One such copy and paste response is: assessments of needs remain delayed as a direct result of Justice Meehan's March 2022 High Court ruling. Minister, I put it to you that the delay in children getting their assessments need is not because of Judge Meehan's High Court ruling. It is simply because the government broke the law. I warned the government at the time that they were breaking the law, but they carried on regardless. The government has spent £1.2 million in legal fees fighting against parents of children with disabilities. Minister Donnelly stated that one of his regrets was not amending the legislation immediately. And I agree that the legislation should be amended, but not to water it down, Minister. It needs to be expanded so that children will get the necessary therapies that they need, be that psychology, occupational therapy or speech and language therapy in a timely manner. Minister, this is an old-fashioned three-card trick where children may move from list to list without getting the actual therapies that they need at the end of this. There is no bigger crime than denying a child the right to reach their full potential.
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Paul Dunn.
Minister, I welcome the U-turn, flip-flop, withdrawal, whatever words you want to use in relation to this Green Paper. First and foremost, the biggest congratulations must go to the disability activists who, from the very start, feared the direction of this Green Paper. And to me, it really brought up the old saying, when England sneezes, Ireland catches a cold. I think we can say with this one, people with disabilities were rightly worried that this English Tory legislation will be implemented by this government. Whilst the current system of disability is not fit for purpose and reform is badly needed, some of the proposals within the Green Paper were not the answer. Minister, for many people with disabilities, the core issues is that they want to work, and it's a much bigger issue just than income. And I met a young woman last week whilst I was canvassing. I know her many years. And she was very distressed, and she was deeply sad that she was stuck in her home. She wanted to work, and she wanted to put all the things that she had learned, all the studies and the courses that she had participated into practice, and wanted to work. And it was very upsetting, I have to say, to take that time to sit down and talk to her, because she saw no hope for all the work that she had done. Employment for people with disabilities opens social possibilities and increases happiness and huge mental health benefits. Employers' attitudes need to change, and the barriers in place need to be removed and brought down. Minister, we need to start developing a cost of living payment. And I think we all remember during COVID the initial shock of most working people when their COVID payment was announced, which led to an immediate flip-flop by the government to increase it to €350 per week. And we look at many people with disabilities who are constantly living in poverty. We welcome some of the more positive aspects of the paper, and some work can be done to progress them, including the proposals to increase disability payments. Another young woman in my constituency who's in college, and she's a disability campaigner, and she just put up on our Facebook page there, "Victory, the Green Paper has been scrapped," and that was the feelings of most people in that sector, and people with disabilities. But we now need to see the conversation move to the cost of disability and delivering a cost of disability payment.
Deputy Pat Buckley.
Minister, thanks very much for being here today. I just want to thank Solidarity People for Profit for bringing this forward. A lot has been covered here, Minister, and it's about disability and justice, and possibly disability and injustice. And I just want to raise in my brief time here, because many people have covered, the options of trying to get work, proper living accommodation, public transport. It's just a myriad of barrier after barrier after barrier. But I'll tell you how bad the system is, and I've raised it with two ministers in here recently, and I can give her name because her mother and the individual gave me permission. Katie from Cove is a 17-year-old girl. She was diagnosed with cerebral palsy when she was around 4. She has an issue with her hip. She's been waiting 14 years for a hip operation, 14 years. Going in to hospitals, being told, oh, it's cerebral palsy, you'll be too weak, or you may not be strong enough, you may get blood clots, excuses after excuses after excuses. I met that girl a number of weeks ago here because she's now an adult, so she's now out of the system. She has been lost in the children's system. She's now gone into the adult system, and they're telling her that if they did operate, the same excuses, but she may never walk again. Yet I have 2 doctors or 2 surgeons in Delaware and 1 in Texas that can actually have this girl up and walking in 6 weeks at a cost of £300,000. If that's not €300,000, if that's not an injustice in this country, because labelling people with a disability because of the failings to ratify the optional protocol here is actually discrimination against those who are less well-abled or well-able-bodied. I mean, we mentioned a while ago about public transport. How do people that actually have an opportunity even to try and get work, they can't access the opportunity to actually travel to these places to get work? Nobody's talking. We're talking about a housing crisis here. Nobody's mentioned, we say properly adapted houses, that makes provisions for everybody, abled or not. I mean, the way we're going here and talking about it, I do welcome the fact that the paper has been scrapped and that there have been some positives maybe, that you can pick out of it. But when we're talking about social justice or disability justice, that poor girl, Katie Byrne, is not the only case that I know in this country. Only just recently I have another girl, she's only 6, has a similar problem, and I spoke to her mother on it, and she is getting the exact same excuses that, well, she'll probably go through the whole system again, and that is what we have to highlight. Nobody should be left behind in this. Deputy Mayor Redford.
Gurmagat, and first of all I'd like to thank People Before Profit Solidarity for bringing forward this motion, and I think that it's really important that we recognise that the voices of people with disabilities were heard, and that thanks to their activism that the Green Paper was scrapped by this government, and that was the right thing to do. And it is essential that all disability policy is centred on a human rights-led approach, and that people are listened to. And I do want to raise the issue of respite in Galway. Minister, it was good to see that 2 weeks ago we saw the opening of Summer Lodge Respite and Four Seasons Day services, and that was very positive. But it was long and hard fought for as well. And we can already see the impact that it is having on families across Galway, and something that was extremely evident on the day of the opening as well. But we're all too aware of the challenges faced by many families who are unable to access respite. Many families across Galway who are unable to access respite. And many of them have come to me, and I'm sure to everyone in this chamber, and said that had they the regular access to respite, that would make the world of difference to them. And additional challenges have been created because of that lack of access, and this shouldn't be the case, and it's something that we need to take seriously in this Dáil. We also need to look at initial assessments. We also need to look at more family support solutions, such as evening-based hubs to allow families to be able to work full-time, and these are all issues that are consistently coming up with me in my office and indeed across Galway. But I do think we also need to look at this place that we're in here now. We need to look at the Dáil, we need to look at the Shannon, and indeed we need to look at the houses of the Oireachtas in its entirety. This is the place that votes and decides on legislation that impacts on everyone, and it's absolutely essential that it becomes far more representative of wider society. And we need to look at what barriers there are to disabled people who want to be elected, and also for those who want to work in this building simply. And the way this Green Paper was handled has shown that there is a long way to go, and we need to make sure that the views of disabled people are heard loud and clear, and we need to look at this chamber, and we need to look at this as a workplace.
Thank you, Deputy. Thank you. Labour Party, Duncan Smith, 8 minutes. Thank you, Deputy.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Solidarity, the People Before Profit, for bringing forward this really welcome motion. The Government's decision to scrap the Green Paper on Disability Service last week was the right thing to do, but it should never have been presented in the first place. And it took much too long to scrap it. And activists in this area deserve a huge amount of praise for the pressure they exerted on this Government. Because the truth of the matter is, this Government has failed to address the systemic issues facing the disabled community. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge my colleague, Dublin City Councillor Declan Mina, who has been a steadfast voice advocating for the abolition and scrapping of the Green Paper. Frankly, what the Government was proposing was absolutely preposterous. It is quite clear that the paper was published with little or no consultation with disabled people and was rightfully opposed by a wide range of people and organisations. As this motion rightfully points out, the foundation of the Green Paper was based on a flawed idea that it is a straightforward process to assess people with disabilities. If this plan had ever come to fruition, many disabled people would have been in a very difficult situation, with invisible and episodic disabilities undoubtedly facing extra huge challenges. There is certainly no evidence that such a proposal would have done anything to lift disabled people out of poverty. Indeed, the scope of the Green Paper itself was much too narrow. The paper itself did not include proposals to remove barriers to employment, such as improving workplace accessibility or disability equality training for employers, and did not address the cost of disability issue in any coherent manner, and did not put any obligations on employers in this regard, despite Ireland having very weak legal obligations on workplace accessibility. By scrapping the Green Paper, I think the Government have finally admitted that it was a half-baked proposal pulled together without proper consideration. Unfortunately, this speaks to how people with disabilities in this country have long been failed. The current system of disability support is not working. There is no denying that, but the concept of a tiered system of supports is simply egregious. We have urged the Department to focus on bringing in the cost of disability payment, and was included in our alternative budget as well in the alternative budget, costed alternative budgets of ourselves and other parties in opposition. We provided allocated funding of 226 million for this. In fact, we were consistent in our budget in addressing a multitude of areas on disability which have so far seen little or no action from government. We would increase the income disregard for disability allowance to fund extra places in employability, to support disabled people into the workplace and provide extra places on the disability wage subsidy scheme, as well as reforming the scheme itself. We'd work to remove the means test for carers allowance, which is the next big challenge we believe needs to be faced with urgency in terms of people who are caring for people, disabled people. On disability services themselves, the government needs to explain why they have not in any significant way moved to address the huge unmet demand for disability services as outlined in their own disability capacity review. Again, we in our alternative budget costed and committed to meeting this demand, allocating a total of £217 million in funding for increased services to cover residential care, day services, PARs, home support, respite care and therapy services, including children's resource and children's disability network teams. Instead, what we got from government was a recruitment freeze in the HSE that has only further exacerbated the already challenged services and put further pressure on these services that have not received the funding or resources that they need. Every aspect of our health service is facing huge waiting lists, from seeing specialists to even getting a GP appointment. Last year we had 10,000 children waiting over 12 months to see a member of a CDNT team. The stress and anxiety caused to children, to young people, to their families and disabled people is absolutely incredible. But this recruitment embargo, every time it's brought up by opposition and by ourselves, is met with an unbelievable response from government that, in fact, the embargo doesn't exist, that the government have in fact hired too many people. Well, they haven't. For example, in my town where I live in Swords, we don't have a social worker at the moment, and we haven't for over a year. So we are the largest town in Ireland that doesn't have a primary care centre, that doesn't have a rail link, that doesn't have a public swimming pool. We're also the largest town in Ireland that doesn't have a social worker. So, this is an absolute one of the many, many examples of how the recruitment embargo is impacting the most vulnerable in society and needs to end ASAP. Last year, I and many others stood with families outside Leinster House and indeed had meetings in government buildings with people with intellectual disabilities who were protesting over the lack of day services. These individuals were school leavers from the North Dublin area, have been referred to St Michael's House through the HSE. They had all attended the organisation's school for children with additional needs and had expected to use the adult day services. However, due to a combination of staff shortages and ultimately the resources provided the organisation, they were unable to get places. Can this government assure us that we're not going to see a similar scenes this year? We need a commitment from the government that individuals with additional needs are not going to be left behind as they leave children's services and enter into adult services. We've come a huge distance in the last 20 or 30 years in terms of how society values and treats people with disabilities. However, this has not been matched by this government. The data is there to support this. Disabled people are twice as likely to be homeless, more likely to be unemployed or underemployed, with Ireland having the highest levels of unemployment among disabled people in the European Union due to the lack of supports, and twice as likely to leave school early and more likely to suffer further ill health. Finally, I want to speak to the optional protocol to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. In 2007, the states signed the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, ratifying the convention in 2018, but is yet to ratify the optional protocol. We want to see the optional protocol ratified now. I welcome the announcement from the Minister and the Minister of State that work to accelerate the ratification of the optional protocol on the UNCRPD was to be undertaken, and I think the House needs to be updated on this work at the earliest possible opportunity. We have rightfully come under scrutiny at the UN level due what can only be seen as a resistance to ratifying this protocol. It is important at the international level that we give people who think their rights have been violated under the Convention a recourse outside of this country. What concerns me, and I know a lot of actors on this issue, is the idea that the reason we haven't seen swift movement to ratify the protocol is because the government do not feel that the care the state provides would meet the rights of persons with disabilities. If anything, this is the reason we need to see positive action on this. It is the state's job to meet these requirements. It is the state's responsibilities. It should not be the responsibility of those who deserve to have the rights met to wait for the state to catch up. I recognise that the Minister and the Minister for State have spoken of the due diligence needed in agreeing any supernatural review. I understand this is important, but the reality is other countries in Europe, the US, Australia and New Zealand ratified the protocol soon after they ratified the UNCRPD. It does not make sense that we are an exception to this. We need to see action on this, and soon, before the lifetime of this government expires. The government can be doing more for disabled people, and I would urge them to take action to increase funding for our disability services so no person is left behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Mick Slot of the Social Democrats. Deputy Holly Cairns, 8 minutes. Thank you.
First of all, I just want to thank Solidarity People Before Profit for putting forward this motion today. And I'd like to start by welcoming the decision by Government to scrap their Green Paper on disability reform. The proposals were highly insulting to disabled people and would have been a massive step backwards for disability rights. It shouldn't have come as a surprise to Government that there was such a strong backlash by disabled people, DPOs and the general public to this deeply offensive plan. The proposal was to replace the disability allowance, invalidity pension and blind pension with a so-called personal support payment. This would have been divided into 3 tiers of payments depending on an individual's ability to work. Under the plan, disabled people would have been subject to a medical assessment by employees in the Department of Social Protection and put into 3 separate categories. Those with no capacity to work to get slightly higher weekly payment, while others would have been expected to take up training or find a job. This proposal was a carbon copy of the discredited system that was introduced in the UK under austerity measures in 2008. Measures that were devastating for disabled people and for anyone in receipt of social welfare. I am so glad that the Government has made a U-turn on this proposal, but I think we need to be very clear, and I think it's very important to highlight the reality of what that approach would have meant. What that same approach meant for disabled people in the UK. Disabled people were presented as benefit cheats by a Tory government who pitted workers against those in receipt of social welfare payments. British media played up the myth that disabled people were not people in need of support, but just people chancing their arm. TV shows such as Benefit Street were responsible for spreading that deeply harmful and insulting misinformation. A show, I have to mention, which was name-checked by Leah Varadkar when the Green Paper was published, as if it was some sort of a legitimate study. What that attitude resulted in was cut after cut to Britain's social welfare system, leaving those with severe disabilities and serious illness with the threat of their essential benefits being cut if they didn't comply with work-related commitments. The vast majority of those who had their benefits cut won on an appeal to restore them, but so many didn't have the resources or the information or the energy to fight the state on that appeal. Poverty levels skyrocketed and people died. We should never have gotten to a point where a proposal replicating that human rights disaster of a system even got to the Minister's desk, let alone got sign-off and approval for publication. It's incredibly worrying that no one in the chain of decision-making in the Department of Social Protection called a stop before now. What on earth is going on in that department? I'm glad that this position has been reversed, but there needs to be serious changes made in social protection's approach to disability reform. Nothing should be done in relation to disability reform without the involvement of disabled people and, crucially, of disabled people's organisations. A Cabinet committee is all well and good, but if we are serious about changing the attitudes and the process of departments and governmental bodies towards inclusion and accessibility, DPOs must be involved at every single stage. The UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities is clear on the need for involvement of DPOs in enacting the Convention. I hope that this experience has impressed upon the Government the need and the value of ensuring that this involvement takes place in future reforms. The new Taoiseach has spoken about breaking down silos across government and making changes happen more quickly. I welcome this new focus and the decision to set up a Cabinet subcommittee on disability. But there have been a lot of Cabinet committees on a lot of different issues, and not many of them have produced any substantial change. What we need to know now is, what will this committee do? When are disability services going to match not only what disabled people need, but what they're entitled to as a right? Because people have been listening to the same promises from different Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil and Green Party ministers for years now. In Fine Gael's case, though, those promises have been made for the past 13 years. One particularly cruel example, Cathaoirleach, of these broken promises was the decision of the Fine Gael Labour government to abolish personal transport supports for disabled people in 2013. At the time, ministers said that abolishing these supports was just a temporary measure, that they would be replaced quickly. More than a decade later, people are still waiting. Last year, the Ombudsman slammed this delay as shameful neglect. He said, "We do not need more committees or reports. We need clear leadership and action." Those words also fell on deaf ears in government. And in the meantime, people cannot rely on public transport for accessibility. The National Disability Authority's 2023 Wellbeing and Social Inclusion Report found that 53% of disabled people have difficulties accessing public transport, and that figure rises to 70% for wheelchair users. Transport, public and personal, is absolutely fundamental to enable people to live independently, to access employment, and to lower the risk of social isolation. Our public transport system is simply not accessible, and it is not fit for purpose. How many times does it have to be pointed out before some actual action is taken? Minister, I'm sure you can understand why people might view these commitments with some kind of scepticism, because they've learned from bitter experience that often these promises amount to nothing. The committees, when they set up, are just talking shops. And that reports, when published, are never acted on. Minister, there's no great mystery about what needs to be done to improve services. There's no secret formula that you or a Cabinet Committee need to work out before taking immediate action. All you need to do is listen to disabled people, take the advice of your own expert reports, and implement change. That latter part, implementation, is what has been missing. And it's the only thing that will actually make a difference. You don't have to wait any longer to take action. There are things government could do this week that would make a significant difference. You could recognise the cost of disability with the cost of disability payment. You could replace that personal transport support that Fine Gael abolished 11 years ago. You could provide actual pay parity for Section 39 workers, many of whom work in Children's Disability Network teams. And you could ratify the optional protocol of the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. All of that could be done now. And you would have the support of the entire chamber. Disabled people, children with additional needs and their families have waited long enough for change. There have been enough broken promises, enough committees, enough reports. Minister, when will this government move on from just describing problems to doing something about them? What actual action will we see?
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Sean Kenny.
Thank you very much, Cathaoirleach, and I do first of all want to compliment People for Profit for bringing forward this very important motion for us to discuss here today. And at the outset, I would say, Minister, that as a member of the Disability Matters Committee, many of the issues that we hear about over the last 3 or 4 years still sadly remain issues. Solutions are not being found. And there's a lot of things that are happening that the government could actually take a hand over and try and sort out without any more to and fro. And first of all, in relation to the cost of living with a disability, we know that the Indicon report has stated back in 2019, I think it was now, that there was an increased cost of living with a disability. That increased cost has got worse with inflation in the intervening years, yet there's no sign of putting in place some sort of support for people with a disability to help them with the cost of living with that disability. And then to compound matters, we have a situation where there was transport and mobility schemes to aid people with disabilities which were withdrawn back in 2011. We had a report that was prepared by Mr. Peter Tyndall, the Ombudsman at the time, in relation to transport for people with disabilities. It was titled Grounded, and I think it is a very apt description of how people with disabilities have been left without getting any support. And so we have a situation at the moment where people in this country, some of whom have a disability, are getting supports, and because people who applied after a certain date, there was no supports available. We also have a very farcical system with the primary medical cert, which was there to help people who need to make adjustments to their car in order to make them more usable and more adaptable. And again, we've set a criteria which means that you need to be an amputee, really. The criteria is so tight that very few people are now getting the primary medical cert. And that was compounded by the fact that the appeals board retired, and there's a difficulty in trying to get a new appeals board in place, because when they resigned because they felt that they were ineffective because there was no latitude in the scheme. We've had promises over the last 3 or 4 years that new schemes were brought in. Working groups have been set up, strategies are going to be developed, and at the same time people are left without any support. So if we are serious about people with disabilities and how we're going to help them live as independently as possible, and to give them the rights that they deserve, and that they are the rights that they're entitled to, we've got to show it by action. So I think the cost of living with a disability and the transport support schemes are 2 areas where, within a very short time, you'd make a huge difference to people's lives. When you have a situation where somebody has a disability and they decide to get married, they are getting the disability allowance, and then they get married, and then the disability allowance is cut because their husband or their wife is working. The disability hasn't changed, but now they become a burden on their wife or husband, and they become reliant on the husband and wife to provide funding for them to live. Just think about it. It's absolutely, it's criminal really in this day and age that we continue with that farcical way of trying to cut people's disability allowance. Disability hasn't gone away. I think that the other thing that I would like to talk about is children's disabilities. And I would say that I had some hope that things might be changing with the Children's Disability Network teams being set up. But the experiences I've had with parents coming in to me trying to get assessments, and this has nothing to do with welfare or anything like this, this is trying to get an assessment. And when I have a situation where parents come in to me and they break down crying, and they're in need of help themselves mentally because they cannot get an assessment for their child. The child might be violent at times at home. The child is uncontrollable at times. Yet when they go to CAMS say, we cannot do anything because we haven't got an assessment. And the CD&T say, oh yeah, that assessment will happen within the next 18 months. So your family's living in hell on earth at the moment because of that. And I witnessed it again in the last week. And I think it's something we need to actually sort out as a matter of urgency. And in our own CD&T, the parents in Tuam, the parents took to the streets last December, just before Christmas, because they have a brand new building. The team have moved in there, and we were told this is going to be the panacea to solve all problems. But the parents found out that it is actually the opposite. It isn't even staffed up to half of what it is required. And at the same time, if somebody can go out and get an assessment in the private sector, the state will not pay for that assessment on principle. And the principle being, let the family suffer, let the child wait, because we're not going to allow you to get a private assessment so that we can move on with things, because it's not long term the right thing to do. But it's not the right thing to do in the short term or the long term for the child or for the family. The other thing that it's in the programme for Government Minister is the ratification of the UN protocol. The Disability Matters Committee did a report last year and issued that report in which it called for the government to put that protocol in place. Because without that protocol in place, we're given lip service to people with a disability, because in the meantime they have no rights that they can exercise, or they cannot take the government to court if they feel they're not getting a service. And the government have it in their programme for government, and the programme or the government time here in office is between now and at best next March. So I hope that the commitment on that protocol will be enacted sooner rather than later. The other issue that I come across is the fact that school places for people with disabilities, especially in special secondary schools and in national schools, people are on a waiting list. I know in one school in Galway, the only secondary school in Galway City, that there's a list of 8 people waiting to get into the school next September. Their parents don't know what's going to happen if they don't get into them schools. And we have, the department will say, we will support an ESD unit, for instance, in a national school, but we'll only give it to you if you have the space to run it yourselves. We're not going to provide additional accommodation. So we have a huge disconnect, and it's not just social welfare, it's disabilities and all that goes with that. And I'll finish at that, Caroline, and thanks for your time. A lot of work to be done.
Next,
thank you.
It's the Rural Independence Group, and I know you're sharing time now, so you have to keep your time. You have 8 minutes.
I want to compliment the movers of this motion, Solidarity PDP. Last year, Minister tried to introduce a British system here, and that has caused uproar, and we know why it would. And the Green Paper has tried to tackle related issues, the cost of disability and low employment rate among people with disabilities, with a single policy change, and that just hasn't worked. And can I just give one, and everybody know what I'm talking about, but use one person to prove my case here. The case of Sean Fogarty. You might have read about the wonderful achievements of Sean Fogarty from Care over the new year. In 2013, a 19-year-old student, Sean, was left paralysed following a devastating car accident. His family were told at the stage that he would never eat, drink or speak again. What is the prognosis? And 11 years since his accident, Sean has overcome massive challenges with the support of his parents, Greta and Kevin Fogarty, and his family and carers. He showed great determination and strength, and after 3 years in hospital and a huge challenge to get him home, get a home care package, Sean eventually returned home to the care of his family in 2016. Since then, Sean has shown great resilience and has went on to complete a Masters. Despite showing such determination and resilience and overcoming so many obstacles, Sean is now essentially restricted from taking up work or to earn over €375 per week. So to do so would result in him losing his medical card. Just imagine that. And Sean is an inspiration to us all and shows what is possible with grit and resilience. However, what Sean can't overcome is the limitations now being put on him by red tape and bureaucracy. After overcoming such challenges, Sean and others like Sean should be allowed to work, seek full employment, and not lose their medical cards and be restricted. So simple things like that mean an awful lot. And if we were to do anything, we were to change those limits and guidelines, because it's totally unfair to people like Sean, who's such an inspiration, and to many other Seans throughout the country.
Yeah, our commitment to fairness and compassion extends to everyone, regardless of their abilities. However, the proposed tiered payments based on the perceived work capacity have significant flaws. They lack meaningful consultation, Minister, with the disabled individuals, the very people most affected by these policies. Without their input, we risk overlooking critical aspects of their needs and experiences. These tiered payments fail to lift disabled individuals out of poverty. Imagine navigating a complex system where your financial well-being hangs on the balance for those with invisible or episodic disabilities. This process becomes even more challenging, impacting mental and physical health. Universal payments offer a fair solution by providing consistent support to all disabled people and carers. We create a safety net. They create a safety net that doesn't discriminate based on perceived abilities. Disabilities is diverse. And while I'm on disabilities, and on the few 30 seconds I've left, I'd like to talk about the disabled certificates for people trying to get disabled certs for cars. It's impossible to get that. Even if you're incapacitated, you can't get it. It's an insane situation that you put in a scheme that doesn't work, Minister. And heads need to roll. It did roll before when it was brought into court. And also about school bus and SNAs, no extra pay for those people who have been working for the last 4 years, up to 6 hours every morning from 6 until 10, and in the evening again, no pay midterm, no pay Easter, Christmas or holidays. These people look after those with disabilities. It's unfair.
Thank you very much, And Minister, at the outset I want to thank People Before Profit and SOL for bringing before us this very important motion. The Green Paper that came out caused great upset amongst not just individuals but the organisations representing people with all different types of disabilities. It was going to lead to a very unfair situation whereby it would actually it would put an unfair disadvantage on people, putting pressure on them if they had a disability and trying to seek work. The different scales of payments wasn't going to be fair or equitable. So I was totally against it. I want to thank, for example, in Kerry, I want to thank Kerry County Council for an example that they show as an employer by trying to always ensure that they employ a proper percentage of people that have different types of disabilities. I want to thank management of Kerry County Council for that role that they have played, not just in recent years but going back with 25 years. They were one of the leading employers in the country to do that. And also the scheme which deals with disabled drivers and passengers still does not make any recognition of blind persons. If you're a blind person, you can't be a disabled passenger, and that's wrong.
Minister, to make it real for a lot of people, 2 weeks ago I was approached by a 78-year-old man who has a son with a disability. His son is living at home, and they've applied for the adoption for the car. They went and they got refused, and they came back with an appeal. They wanted the 78-year-old man to drive to Dublin to do the appeal. We've asked them to know, can they reconvene the appeal? Could they bring it to Limerick? They said they'll do what they can to try and bring the appeal. This man is 78 years of age. His son has a disability. And sometimes his son can get a weakness, and he has to try, at 78, to try and get him into the car to get him medical help. I have another case in the office where a couple they got married and one of them has a disability. And now the disability has been cut. I had another couple and they were married for 3 years and it wasn't twigged by the departments, and now they want to backdate and take money off the person that's a disability. This is all wrong. If you have a disability and you qualify for a payment, regardless whether you're married or have a partner or not, you still have the disability. And you can't change that. The appeal system is very slow, and bringing people to Dublin to do an appeal to have a disability, the first thing the department should look at is we should go down and meet them if there's to be an appeal and investigate it. Not bringing people all the way to Dublin when they're already trying to fight a case for their loved ones. The government need to see that from people with disabilities, that people that work with disabilities, they want to contribute the same as everybody else. But you make everything so difficult and you make everything circled about getting your departments to Dublin. That needs to change, Minister. You need to make sure that it comes into the county, and they need to make sure that they have the services in place, that they come down and they meet the people with the disabilities. Thank you.
I want to thank People Before Profit for bringing this very worthy motion here today. And it's very clear that people with disabilities are not being funded properly. And the money that was wasted, I think the money that has been wasted on the referendum, 29 million, what that would do for people with disabilities. I suppose all of us, Minister, would like, we like to have some place to go, something to do and to be relevant. And what I'm asking to ensure that young people who become disabled, accidents or whatever, and who have a disability, that they be helped to get them to be able to do something. And that they want to be relevant, because they may have lost most of their faculties, but they still have some, and they should be allowed to use them. One shining beacon in that, we have a shining example of that, is Ian O'Connell in Kerry, who was paralysed to most of his faculties. But he's become a beacon for all people with disabilities in the wonderful programme that he hosts on Kerry Radio every Wednesday night. And it is wonderful to listen to him, even though that he had such a disability accident, that he's doing wonderful, and it's great to hear him each Wednesday night on Kerry Radio, because it proves that people with disabilities can play a role in our life.
Sorry, thank you, Deputy. Are you sharing time, Deputy?
I am sharing with Deputy Harkin 4 minutes each.
Thank
you. Sorry, I wish to thank People for Profit Solidarity for presenting this private member's motion today in the Dáil chamber. I also welcome the news that the Government is planning to scrap the Green Paper on disability reform. The proposals were widely condemned by a broad coalition of disability, mental health and carers groups. I'm glad the Government has recognised, like everybody else recognised, just how unfit for purpose the Green Paper was. However, this was a shameful attempt to reform a system to benefit the state, not the people who rely on disability payments to live on. The problem is you can scrap the Green Paper, albeit you've said that it was a consultation paper, but how it got to the Minister's desk is absolutely beyond me. But we know now what the Government's thinking is. A system designed to make the state's life easier at the expense of people living with disability or caring for somebody with a disability. This was a medical approach which sought to categorise people into tiers based on how capable to work the state decided they were, not a social model seeking to support people in need. There was little to no recognition of the costs people with disabilities and their carers face, and the plan ignored the growing problems with disability poverty, with even the highest level of support, so-called Tier 1, being significantly below the poverty line. We already know the cost of disability in Ireland, and the Social Protection Department report in 2021 estimated the cost of living with a disability was between $8,700 and $12,300 per annum, and accounting for inflation would now be between $9,800 and $13,800. The Green Paper was a totally inhumane approach to force people to work, not support them. It viewed people as commodities that could be categorised, designated and costed. It sought to put the burden of overcoming employment barriers on those who face the barriers, not those who have created them. The Department of Social Protection had indicated they expected that potentially 50% of existing social protection recipients would be assessed as Tier 3. We could have been seeing a situation where half of people in receipt of disability payments could have been forced back to work, and we know just how dangerous that would be from looking at the barbaric disability reform the Tory party has implemented in England. A survey carried out in conjunction with the Centre of Welfare Reform in 2021 found that in Britain, when engaging with their Department of Work and Pension Section on employment matters in relation to disability payments, 13% said they had attempted suicide as a result, and 61% said they had considered suicide. You've obviously learned no lessons from the massive damage and hurt the Tories unleashed on people with disabilities in Britain. You wanted a cost-saving exercise at the expense of the well-being of people living with disabilities. This is twice now, and this is why I came out strongly for a no vote in the March 8th care referendum, where this government has tried to change the state's responsibility for people with disability and their carers. The Green Paper sought to implement a system in which worst-case scenario could have been forced back to work, and best-case scenario forced to live on supports that are below the poverty line. We need a system that treats people with disabilities with dignity, not objects to be costed and categorised, that recognises the cost of disability and the care and provides both people living with disabilities and carers with a decent standard of living. We need to directly target the real problems in our system of disability welfare, the high levels of disability poverty and deprivation, and this should be based on the implementation of the UN CRPD as a basis for a social model of supports and rights. I hope the Minister supports the Disability Bill 2023 proposed by Senator Tom Clonan this week. And judging from the Green Paper and the care referendum, I have no faith this government will implement such a system.
Thank you, Lascan Corla. First of all, can I thank people before profit for introducing this motion, and whoever can claim the credit. And I know a lot of different people have been lobbying on this, but I'm very pleased to see that the Green Paper on disability reform has been pulled, as it were. Now, the Minister has said it was just a consultation paper, and while I accept her bona fides, I hope that lessons will be learned from what has happened in the meantime, with the substantive issues and concerns that were raised being dealt with. A hugely important part of this will be full consultation with people who have a disability, and also to ensure that the ableist and discriminatory obstacles that were put in place are removed from any future Green Paper. The Green Paper had at its core a proposal to categorise disabled people for the purposes of allocating social welfare payments, because this enshrined in the paper the possibility, indeed the probability, of discrimination between different people who have a disability. So you'd have them competing with one another for resources, and that is simply not acceptable. I think it was dangerous, it was morally degrading, because the objective seemed to be to reduce costs rather than supporting disabled people to work. And Minister, given that we have the lowest rate of employment for disabled people, and given the additional cost of living with disability, that Green Paper would have been a disaster. Now, this motion is aptly entitled Disability Justice, and I support its asks. Maybe some nuances around the means testing for certain payments, but I fully support no means testing for carers allowance, whether you call it carers allowance or a guaranteed living wage. You don't get carers allowance unless you care full-time for a person who needs full-time care. Therefore, your payment cannot be dependent on the household income. It completely undervalues the work of carers, and indeed it's discriminatory very often against women, and that has to change. In regard to the introduction of payments to cover the cost of disability, I fully support this. The Department of Social Protection published a paper, The Cost of Disability, which, when we account for recent inflation, would come in at between about 10,000 to 14,000 per year extra, simply to cover the cost of disability. And it's absolutely urgent that the next budget would introduce a cost of living or equity payment to help cover this extra cost. We also need to be aware that the employment and wage subsidy scheme for disabled people is the lowest in Europe. It's medicalised. It asks a disabled person to sign a piece of paper to say they are 20% less productive than their non-disabled colleagues. This scheme is flawed and it sends the wrong message. Instead, Minister, we should be trying to support disabled people into employment, and in all cases, supports should follow the person. Finally, in regard to personal assistance, there is no legal right to personal assistance in this state, and the government needs to prioritise investment in personal assistance. And again, the next budget should invest in personal assistance rather than residential care or services that continually segregate people with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. Next speaker is Violet Henwin. 2 minutes.
I want to firstly thank People for Profit for using their PMB slot this week for this very important motion. Minister, I want to firstly say that it was fantastic news that the Green Paper for disability reform has been scrapped. Disabled people in my constituency were actually horrified at the proposal to categorise disability in 3 tiers according to perceived ability or inability to work. I want to also acknowledge and thank the Clare Leader Forum, who were first out of the trap in terms of responding to the proposal, organising consultations locally, which I attended. They stated then that there was not enough focus on actually tackling the barriers that people with disabilities face in trying to access the workforce. The Green Paper did nothing to address those issues, and that is where the department needs to direct their focus from here on in. We need to change the tide in terms of Ireland and its poor performance in respect of people with disabilities and employment. The Clare Leader Forum say don't just scrap it, go further, put substantial supports to help disabled people in employment reform grants paid directly to employers for hiring disabled people, invest grants towards employment supports to ensure disabled people have the resources to go to work, and they also are looking for the separate possession of medical card from employment status. Many disabled people were afraid to take up work because they may lose their medical card, and we need to ensure that there's a human rights approach. In my very short time that I have left, I want to speak about local issues. There's a desperate need for at least 4 additional respite homes to ensure that those that need respite can avail of it, because currently they're actually presenting to UHL Emergency Department, which is not appropriate for them. There are many issues with assessment of needs in County Clare, with some waiting over 400 days. There is still no option for reimbursing those that acquire private assessments, and there is a major job of work to be done in terms of regulating those private practitioners. I also just want to briefly mention the disabled drivers and passenger schemes, as I've had no progress to date in relation to a carer and his individual that he cares for in County Clare, because they're not family, and I was hoping for legislative change in relation to that.
Thank you, Deputy. I now call on the Minister Oisin Smith. 10 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Deputies, for all your contributions. First, I just want to mention one point raised by Deputy Matty McGrath, who asks about people who lose their medical card after taking up employment, and this was raised by other deputies. So just to reassure deputies that if a person takes up work, they can retain their medical card for 3 years. Mr Humphreys has sought to make sure that the interests of people with disabilities and carers remain a focus of her department's priorities. She has worked to ensure that they are properly supported, and she has taken targeted measures to increase payment rates and earnings disregards, and to expand employment supports and secondary benefits. The Government has increased the weekly rate of disability payments by €29 over the last 3 budgets. To mitigate the rising cost of living, we've introduced lump sum payments which totalled €900 over the last 2 winters. This increased to €2,000 for disabled people living alone and getting the fuel allowance. To improve employment for disabled people, this Government has increased the Reasonable Accommodation Fund by €1 million and has allocated an additional €3.7 million to reduce the minimum required hours for the wage subsidy scheme from 21 hours to 15 hours per week. And Minister Humphreys announced last October that she's extending the free travel scheme for the first time to people who are medically unfit to drive. The Cost of Disability report, published by the Department of Social Protection in 2021, highlighted the need for a whole-of-government approach to tackling poverty and a wide range of economic and social issues faced by disabled people in Ireland. Issues such as access to health and social services, accessible transport and career guidance in schools for young people with disabilities requires a holistic approach to addressing them. Negative attitudes in society need to be addressed to ensure people with disabilities can participate actively in work and in all aspects of life. Taoiseach has announced the setting up of the Cabinet Committee on Disability, and I think we all agree that this is a very welcome development. Alongside this new Cabinet Committee, a new disability strategy is being developed. This is being coordinated by the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth with a whole-of-government approach. This is an important and timely piece of work which will set the direction of policy to improve outcomes for disabled people. I note that the motion calls for the ratification of the optional protocol of the United Nations Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I want to assure you that we are progressing with this, and in fact Minister O'Gorman's officials will this month convene an interdepartmental group to work through the issues arising and to bring a renewed focus to the necessary enabling work to provide for the ratification of the optional protocol. Given the significance, the complexity and the breadth of issues involved, all relevant government departments and the Office of the Attorney-General will be invited to participate in the work of the group. Minister O'Gorman will subsequently report to Cabinet on the work of the group.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Oisin Smith. Reid Smith, I'm sorry.
What did you call me?
I called you, I'm sorry, I called you the Minister's name.
thanks, Breed, for your contribution. Just on the last point you made there, Breed, about the optional protocol, that was very much civil service speak, that this is complexity and we have to progress the issue and have meetings and all the rest of them. How many years are disability campaigners like the ones outside the gate now who are celebrating the scrapping of the Green Paper are campaigning for the optional protocol to be instituted? It cannot be rocket science. And why do we create these torturous, long pieces of work around something that for other countries seems to be very, very simple? And I tell you why. Because this government has done everything it can to avoid people with disability and their rights and their lives and their quality of life being challenged in courts. And it's a bit like the reason why when Roderick O'Gorman said to me here in this House when we were discussing the referendum bill that you cannot compel governments to do something in the future. And that was in relation to we will strive to support carers in this society. And the weakness of the strive to language had led to the falling of that referendum. But imagine the Minister said, you cannot in the Constitution compel governments to do something in the future. And as I said to him at the time, then what's the point of a Constitution if governments aren't being compelled to uphold the rights of the citizens who live under that Constitution? And so really you need to get the finger out on the optional protocol, because the people outside the gate today are determined to win more battles for the justice for people with disability. They want to see a proper payment that they can live on, like during COVID, where we proved that everybody needed at least €350 a week to live off. That hasn't changed just because the virus isn't around. People still need that sort of minimum payment. They want to see an end to the means testing for carers. Absolutely disgraceful that carers are subjected to that means test year after year after year. That should be just a normal payment for carers. And I just want to make an overarching point on care and the system we live under. Kathleen Lynch, the professor in UCD, has written an excellent book called Care Under Capitalism, and everybody in this House should read it, because what she shows is that the system we live under undervalues, completely undervalues, one of the most important aspects of human beings, society, and how we live together, and that is how we can and should care for each other, and that everything else is put to one side for that reason. And this is particularly important going into the future, where we're fighting, and as a member of the Green Party this would be familiar to you, the argument that what we need is a Green New Deal that puts a society for care and repair to the head of it, repair of the environment and care of each other. And in order to do that, we have to get rid of this notion that everything must make a profit in order for it to be viable. It is not viable to try and make a profit out of disabilities and to try and make sure that their rights are met within financial constraints. And so the last point I want to make is around transport services, because there's so much aspects of public transport that damage the lives of people with disabilities. First and foremost is the question of access to bus stations, bus stops and DART stations. This morning the Dunleary DART station lift is out of action. If it wasn't Dunleary, it'd be Kilbarrack or it'd be Holt. There is constant lack of access to the DART because of the state of disrepair of the service. That has to be addressed. Imagine if you're in a wheelchair and you arrive to take a train into town or go to a medical appointment or go and see your family, and you can't actually access the train because of the lack of infrastructure. And the second thing is, and it's a simple point, our bus infrastructure can only facilitate one wheelchair at a time. And as one of the wheelchair users said to me today, I like to go out with my mates, and a lot of my mates are in wheelchairs. So if two people want to go out together, to go for coffee, go into town, do something together, only one of them can get on the bus. And these are very simple, underrated issues that we need to look after, to adapt and to support public transport so that everybody is included. And it's a general point about our environment again, is that when we make it accessible, usable, convenient and a pleasure, then it's a pleasure for everybody, not just for the people who are most disadvantaged and who suffer from disabilities. It enhances life for all of us if we factor the issues around public transport and design of our cities into how we make provision.
Deputy McMurray.
Yeah, so I want to make some summing up remarks, if you like, on the debate that we've just had. So a lot of the contributions from the various deputies centred on the issue of the Green Paper, and I think it's clear that a wide variety of deputies in this House are pleased about the fact that the Green Paper has been scrapped thanks to the pressure the government were put under by the disability campaigners first and foremost. I do, however, think that some of the contributions from the opposition to the debate on that issue were a bit on, how will I describe it? We're a bit on the soft side. For example, I'm not sure if there would be many disability activists who would agree with Sinn Féin Deputy Donncha O'Leary that the government were not fully aware of the harmful effects that the proposals contained in the Green Paper would have. I think the government were given a benefit of the doubt there that wasn't deserved. I believe that the government and the senior civil servants were well aware of what the Green Paper meant. And I wouldn't give them that benefit of the doubt at all. There was a significant amount of discussion around what will, I think, now emerge as a key, if not perhaps the key issue confronting us on disability more broadly, which is the question of means testing and the question of a living payment. And again, I think there were claims made in the debate which don't really tally with the reality of life for people with disabilities. The Minister made the point that there had been a €29 increase in payments over the last 3 budgets. But other deputies referred to the Indicon report on the cost of living with disability, which, you know, in today's terms is between €10,000 and €14,000 per annum. So, you know, minor incremental increases like that don't come near to dealing with that reality. And I think that we need to shift the debate onto the idea of a real living income for people with disability rather than minimal increases at budget times. Having said all of that, I want to concentrate my closing remarks on the government's contribution to the debate. It seems from the debate that the government are not going to oppose the motion. They haven't opposed any kind of counter motion. They haven't said that they will not vote for the motion, so I'm presuming that they're going to vote for it or that they're going to allow it in some way to go through. I do see that as a cynical ploy to avoid being seen in a poor light. But the government deputies should be clear, and I'm making sure that they're clear from my comments here. Vote for this motion, allow this motion to go through, and you will be held to account on the commitments that are contained within the motion. To mention just 2, the motion calls for the immediate ratification of the UN CRPD optional protocol. You haven't even named a date for its ratification. Vote for this. This motion goes through tonight. Expect the pressure on that front to increase. The motion calls for an end to means testing of disability payments and their replacement with a income that genuinely covers the cost of disability. So, again, if this motion passes in the Dáil tonight, the government should immediately factor that in to the planning, the early planning arrangements for the budget in the autumn. And I would say to the government and the government deputies to expect to feel real pressure from disability activists campaigning on the idea of a living income should you fail to do that. Sinead, thank you.
As the debate has concluded, I now want to put the motion to the House. Deputies that are in favour of the motion say "Tá." Deputies that are against the motion say "Nil." The motion is carried.